Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, I'd like to develop what I've called earlier the new view of property rights, the one that associates a different property right with every different use to which a particular object might be put. This means that there can be potentially a very large number of different property rights associated with the same object, which differs from the older view, which associated only a very small number of different property rights, possession, use, and disposition with any particular object. The new view multiplies enormously the number of property rights associated with any given object. To illustrate this idea, I've asked you to look at an example of a dorm room, a college dormitory room like the one on the picture. Let's imagine, although it isn't really the case, that this is a picture of a dormitory room on my own college campus. I work at a school called Wesleyan University, which is located in a small city in the center of Connecticut called Middletown, Connecticut, and Connecticut itself is in the northeastern part of the United States. On our campus, the dormitories are on the campus, and so students live in rooms on the campus in buildings which are, and I'll use this word advisedly, owned by the university. So let's imagine that the room in the picture is a Wesleyan University dorm, and let's imagine that it is occupied by a young woman whom we'll call Simone. So the question before the floor is the question at the top of the slide: whose room is it? If we were to ask Simone whose room it was, she'd almost certainly give us the answer that it's her room. But as we've seen, under the new view of property, the answer might be somewhat more complex than that. The real question to ask, in terms of whose room it is to ask what different people could actually use the room for. So the first question is, what can Simone do in the room? Well, obviously she can live there, and will associate with living there a whole range of activities which is, in principle, open-ended. She can sleep there, she can study there, she can talk with her friends there, she can, as you can see, use her computer. There seems to be a microwave in the room. She can use her little television. She can do all sorts of things in the room that are associated with living in it. And she can invite other people into the room if she chooses, and she can invite those other people to use the room in the way that she can use the room. So she can invite somebody else to sleep there, she could invite somebody else to study there, she could invite somebody else to do any of the things in the room that she's entitled to do in the room herself. By the same token, since she has the right to invite people to come in, she also has what the older theorists would call the right of possession, which means that she doesn't have to let anybody in that she doesn't want to let in. That is, because she controls that use of the room, entry into it for the purposes of studying, etc., she can invite some people in, and she can exclude other people by simply not inviting them in and closing the door on them. Where did Simone get these rights? Well, at our university, she got the rights in a housing contract between her and Wesleyan. In the housing contract, Simone agrees to pay a certain sum of money for the right to live in the room between September and June of the academic year. She gets these rights, as I say, by purchasing them from the university. Our university, as I speak, has a president named Mike, and so we'll personalize Wesleyan by calling Wesleyan Mike. And Simone, therefore, got the rights that she has to use the room in the way that she can by buying those rights from Mike as part of a contract. She's paid for them, he's delivered them, and those property rights belong to her. But you'll notice in the picture that there are posters all over the wall. Who has the right to nail those posters to the wall? Well, we need to check the contract. That is, the contract that conveyed a certain set of property rights from Mike to Simone because that contract may well have allowed for Mike to keep or retain some rights to use the room in particular ways. At our university, Mike retains the right to nail a nail into the wall to hang up a poster. And he typically chooses to exercise this right negatively. That means not that he is able to enter into Simone's room and nail a poster to the wall himself, because he has the right to do so. What he does, alternatively, is to exercise the right negatively by forbidding Simone to nail a nail into the wall without Mike's permission. How could Simone get Mike's permission to nail a nail into the wall? Well, the easiest answer is that she would simply do it, to take the poster and nail it to the wall. But at Wesleyan, if a student nails a poster to the wall, that student will be asked to pay a fine to compensate Wesleyan for the cost of repairing the wall once the student has left the room and the nail has been pulled along with the poster. Indeed, at Wesleyan, many dormitory rooms contain a menu of prices for certain kinds of rights that Mike retains to the room that students might seize against Mike's will and without his consent. So, for example, Mike retains the right not just to nail nails into the wall, he retains the right to use an old-fashioned hot plate, that is, to cook food in a room, and he chooses to exercise the right to use a hot plate negatively by forbidding Simone or anyone else within his power from using a hot plate in the room. Could Simone use a hot plate? Could she nail posters to the wall? Obviously she could. But if she did, she'd have to pay Mike the cost of transferring that right from Mike to Simone, that is encapsulated in the stipulated fine. So now we have two people who own property rights in Simone's room. Simone, who has the right to live there, and Mike, who has the right to nail posters to the wall, a right that he exercises negatively, except for the payment of fines, which represent a transfer of that property right from Mike to the person who's nailed the nails into the wall and paid for that right by paying the fine. So another question arises. Suppose Simone says, well, the pizza on the campus is awful. I think I could make a lot of money if I simply opened a pizza business in my room and made better pizza than students can get at the other alternative pizza places around the campus. Could she do so? Who has the right to operate a pizza business from Simone's room? The answer is not Simone and not even Mike. But, in fact, the Middletown, Connecticut Planning and Zoning Board has the right to tell Simone whether she may or may not operate a pizza business from her room. Obviously, operating a pizza business is not anything that's intrinsically wrong. Pizza businesses operate everywhere quite legally, and people enjoy the pizzas that they make, and everybody is happy. But pizza businesses can't be opened just anywhere, and almost every part of the United States has what are called zoning laws. And zoning laws tell people what kinds of uses they can put to land in what particular locations in a particular jurisdiction. So a zoning law might say all the buildings in this particular portion of a city will be residential buildings. Or it might say all the buildings in another part of the city will be commercial buildings. Or all the buildings in a third part of the city will be devoted to heavy manufacturing, and so on. It's the Planning and Zoning Commission of Middletown that gets to say whether Simone can operate a pizza business in her room, and will personalize the Planning and Zoning Commission by identifying it with the government of the city of Middletown, which, as I speak, has a mayor named Dan. Since the Planning and Zoning Commission has the say-so over whether or not Simone can operate a pizza business in her room, we say that it is the property right holder of the property right to operate the pizza business in Simone's room. Could Simone buy the right from Mayor Dan and thus open a pizza parlor in her room? Well, not literally. If she actually did try to pay money to Mayor Dan or the Planning and Zoning Commission, she and they would have committed a crime, the crime of bribery. But it certainly is within the discretion of the Planning and Zoning Commission to allow people, Simone or someone else, to run a pizza business in Simone's room. So, the Planning and Zoning Commission, Mayor Dan, has the right to use the property right negatively. That is, it can forbid anyone, including Mayor Dan himself, from entering Simone's room to operate a pizza business, but the Planning and Zoning Commission, Mayor Dan, may decide, for whatever good reasons it might have, to allow people to do so. Since they get to say so, they're the ones who hold the property right. Now we have three owners of different property rights in Simone's room: Simone, Mike, and Mayor Dan. Consider a fourth use of Simone's room. Who has the right to use cocaine in Simone's room? There's a picture of some cocaine up there now, and the answer, one might think, is nobody. Using cocaine in a dormitory room, indeed using cocaine anywhere in the state of Connecticut, is a crime against the state of Connecticut, and so we'll say that the governor of Connecticut, who's also named Dan, holds the property right to use cocaine in Simone's room. Again, what we mean by Governor Dan is not Governor Dan himself as a person, since if he were to try to enter Simone's room and use cocaine, he too would be arrested and made to pay a penalty for using the cocaine. Instead, the state of Connecticut attempts to stop everybody, Simone, Mike, Mayor Dan, Governor Dan, everybody, from using cocaine in Simone's room. Could Simone buy the right from Governor Dan? Well, she could indeed. How would she do so? In the same way that she would buy the right to nail a nail into the wall from Mike. She could simply use the cocaine in the room. If she did use the cocaine in the room, she would have taken the entitlement from Dan, taken the property right from Dan to use cocaine in the room, which Dan had been attempting to exercise negatively by excluding her from using the cocaine in the room. She would have seized that entitlement from Governor Dan, that property right, and she would have used it to use the cocaine. But she then, most likely, would be arrested and made to pay a penalty set by Governor Dan. And so analogously to the way in which Simone could purchase the property right to nail posters in the wall by paying the appropriate fine to Mike, she can also appropriate the right to use cocaine in her room from Governor Dan simply by paying Governor Dan's price, which will be considerably higher than Mike's price for nailing a poster into the wall. Finally, we might ask, who has the right to make a nuclear weapon in Simone's room? Actually, as some students at Princeton have discovered, making a nuclear weapon is technically not all that difficult. You can make it with easily available components along with a small amount of weapons-grade plutonium. So let's ask, who has the right to get that weapons-grade plutonium, to get those easily available parts, and construct an atomic bomb like the one in the picture in Simone's room? And the answer to this is that the government of the United States of America has that right. And we'll personalize the government by calling it Barack, who happens to be, as I speak, the President of the United States. Barack has the right to make nuclear weapons in Simone's room, and he exercises it negatively as best he can, not just in Simone's room, but everywhere. Well, not quite everywhere in the United States, because there are two places in the United States, each of them housing a different company, one of them in New Mexico, housing the Sandia Laboratories, and one of them in Tennessee, housing the Oak Ridge laboratories, where America's nuclear weapons are made. And they're made there because Barack, the government of the United States, has allowed those two organizations to produce nuclear weapons in the places where they exist. And so, although Barack has the authority to exercise the property right to make nuclear weapons anywhere in the United States negatively, he chooses to exercise those rights negatively by barring people from making nuclear weapons almost everywhere except for those two places, one in New Mexico and one in Tennessee. So we'll ask again, could Simone buy the right from Barack? Well, yes, she could, in exactly the same way that she bought the right to nail posters into the wall from Mike and the right to use cocaine from Governor Dan, if she were willing to pay the penalty that Barack will impose upon her for building the nuclear weapon in her room. So, we now have 5 different owners of property rights to Simone's room, each of them owning a different property right associated with a different use of the room itself. The first, of course, is Simone herself, who has the right to live there. She can work there, she can entertain friends there, and she can exclude others from entering the room and partaking of these activities without her consent. Then, Mike, as we've seen, can forbid posters to be hung with nails, and therefore he owns the property right to nail the nails into the wall, and he does forbid posters from being hung, but he does have a procedure to enable people to purchase that property right from him if they're willing to pay the penalty that he sets for nailing nails into the wall. A third property right owner is Mayor Dan, who can allow a pizza parlor to operate anywhere within the city limits of Middletown, and also, therefore, can choose to disallow a pizza parlor from operating anywhere in the city of Middletown, and Mayor Dan has, as we speak, made it illegal. That is, denied the right to open a pizza parlor in any dormitory room on the Wesleyan campus. Governor Dan goes further and forbids the use of cocaine in Simone's room, not just by Simone, not just by Governor Dan himself, but by everybody. Where Mayor Dan might allow some pizza parlors to operate somewhere, Governor Dan would like to see the use of cocaine forbidden everywhere in the state of Connecticut. And finally, Barack can allow nuclear weapons to be made if he wishes, or he can deny people the right to make nuclear weapons where they wish to make them, and therefore he owns the property right to make nuclear weapons not just in Simone's room, but anywhere in the United States. And there's one other way in which property rights attach to Simone's room, and that is property rights distinguished in time. Each of the 5 property rights that I've already discussed are rights that exist right now. Simone has the right to live in her room right now. Mayor Dan has the right to prohibit the pizza parlor right now, etc. But in the housing contract, Simone has only purchased what rights she has in the dormitory room from Mike for the academic year that begins in September and ends in June. This is the year 2012 and 13, and Simone's housing contract would expire in June of 2013. At that moment, all the property rights that she had in the room during the academic year 2012 and 13 would disappear, and she would be left with no property rights in the room at all. All of the property rights that she had in the room between 2012 and 2013 now revert back to Mike. Indeed, they never left Mike, because the only rights that he sold to Simone were the rights that she has from September of 2012 to June of 2013. And so it would be possible for Mike in 2012 to sell the rights to live in Simone's room to somebody other than Simone for the academic year 2013-2014. Simone will be gone in June of 2013, and so Mike can sell the rights that Simone had in 2012 and 13 to somebody else to use in the year 2013 and 14, and he can make that sale today so that that person will have the property rights at some period in the future. And so, every property right to every use can also be divided, potentially infinitely, into the future. You can have the property right to do X in the room now, or you could have the different property right to do X in the room next year, and different people could hold this different property right at the same time. So, to summarize what we've seen about the dorm room, is that associated with the dorm room, in the new view of property, are a potentially infinite number of property rights, each one associated with a different use of the room, and each one associated with a different moment in time. And we've seen that different people may hold the same right, different people may hold rights to different uses at the same time. That was what we saw with our 5 property holders. They all held rights to use the room in a different way, but they all held those rights at the same time during the current academic year while Simone is living in the room. But toward the end, when we saw that Mike could sell the right to live in the room to somebody other than Simone for some period in the future, we've also seen that different people may hold rights to the same use, but those rights apply at different times. Hence, a potentially infinite number of rights divided amongst a potentially infinite number of uses and spread across a potentially infinite number of periods of time into the future.